Hey everyone, it's Camber here with YoPro in the Know. Thank you for joining us today. We are here with Wilson Roberts, 28-year-old account exec at Nihilus, a SaaS company out in Denver, Colorado. Tom Bennett was a former interviewee of the YoPro Know a couple of months ago, and he connected us with Wilson. But Wilson and I actually go way back. We both attended Furman University. I think we only overlapped about 1 year there, but we've seen each other since, and I've really enjoyed watching his career, and I'm excited to learn more today. So, Wilson, thanks so much for being on YoPro in the Know.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're going to get started just by hearing a brief background. So, where you're from, where you're currently working, and then we'll dive into more of those details.
Sure. Yeah. So grew up outside of Boston. Boston, Massachusetts is always the hometown, but ended up down at Furman with Camber, and then ended up in DC working for a company called 2U. So I was a political science major at Furman. Thought I wanted to do the whole Hill thing. Did an internship on the Hill in college. Decided that as much as I love DC, politics probably wasn't for me. And ultimately had a cousin that actually still works at 2U in the DC metro area. And then they moved me out to Denver about a year in, and I was with them for about 5 years. And then actually got laid off last September from there, and have since joined Nihilus, where I am now, and where I am helping on our primarily our inbound sales team, but doing some outbound work as well, which has been an awesome transition. So been at Nihilus since January.
Great. Thank you so much for that recap, Wilson. I would love to stop now and talk about what that transition looked like for you.
Sure.
So, you have the floor.
Yeah. So I really, I mean, I worked my way up through the ranks at 2U. It's a different type of, we would label ourselves as a SaaS company. 2U would label themselves as a SaaS company. And what they're doing is their intellectual property is a learning management system platform that schools can utilize, particularly right now during COVID, but that they can utilize to run their online degree programs. And then ultimately they got into the short course space as well as the boot camp space. And what was interesting about my time there was that I was in sales. I was in what I would call inside sales while there. But what we were doing was we were recruiting students into these grad programs and helping to facilitate the beginning of their relationship with these schools. And so it was a very non-traditional sales environment. There are a lot of rules and regulations around incentive compensation when it relates to higher education. So while I felt like the training that I received while there was probably some of the best sales training that a salesman or a saleswoman could get, ultimately it was very difficult when I was laid off, and I was laid off at the director level, to then go and find a closer type role within the SaaS space, which is where I really wanted to be. And that's of no fault of 2U or where I was coming from. That was simply because getting into sales is very difficult when you want to transition directly into a closer role. Sales is interesting because oftentimes you have to take a step back to take a step forward. You need to go be a BDR because so many of these organizations are looking for you to have subject matter expertise when you're coming into their world. And so for me, coming from the education space, there are very few companies out there that my subject matter expertise would be transferable to. And so what I found when I was going through this process of ultimately ending up at Nihilus was, of course, I was, laid off along with a lot of other people, and we all had different perspectives on how we should go about this process. And I'm sure a lot of your followers now, as they're going through this process through COVID, are finding much the same thing. Is that, there's a few different ways you can go about it, but some chose to say, okay, I know that I need to take a step back. I'm going to go take a BDR role at a really, name brand organization that ultimately will allow me to continue to work my way up through the ranks. Sorry about the Slack notification there. Pause that.
It's important.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, some people chose to go that route, but for me, I was so set on this idea that I had worked so hard to get myself up to this title of director that why shouldn't I have an opportunity to go and be a closer for one of these really big companies? And what I ultimately found was quite a humbling experience. You had to find a lot of different dead ends. You had to have a lot of connections and a lot of resources and a lot of people that were willing to take a chance on you just to get an interview, much less get an offer. So for me, I was coming from having 2 years of management experience. A lot of the feedback I received was, well, you haven't been an individual contributor for 2 years. How do you expect us to take a chance on you? A lot of the feedback was, well, you didn't work in this space and you haven't been an individual contributor for 2 years. We don't want to take a chance on you, right? So as the fall progressed and we got closer to the holidays, I was progressing really well for another management type role. That was, going really nicely. I was really excited about it. And then that didn't come through. And then it's Thanksgiving and the hiring season seems to all be falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I got really discouraged, quite frankly.
I bet. I was about to say that's got to be not only, I mean, it's probably very humbling, like you said, but discouraging. And you're kind of like, what's next? Where do I go next?
Right. And what I, ultimately did was I took a trip. I went and visited my sister who was living in Ireland at the time. And when I came back, I had this renewed focus. And I think, one of the points that I'd like to make on here is a lot of you are probably feeling the same way right now. That holiday feeling that I was feeling in terms of the hiring season really being over is probably what a lot of you are feeling right now as you go through hiring during COVID. There's just so much demand for jobs and there's too many people to ultimately fill them, right? And it's just, not a time when a lot of companies are hiring. But what I would say is find individuals that really, and this is particularly relevant for sales, but I think it goes across the board, find individuals that have had a similar track to you, because what ultimately paid off for me is I was able to find individuals that had made that transition from whether it was higher education, for-profit education, whatever it might be, where you could say that they were doing sales and they would tell you that they were doing sales. Find those individuals, ask them, just go to them, have an informational interview, talk to them about how they ultimately ended up in the industry that you ultimately want to be in, and then pick their brain about their network and possible fits. And once I started doing that, the web just ultimately really expanded for me. And that's how I came about finding Nihilus, which ultimately, though it took 4 months to get here, I would say it feels like a perfect fit, and I hope they would agree.
That's great. Thank you for giving us that recap of, and very, personal experience. Obviously, those 4 months that you were unemployed, I'm sure that was, again, very discouraging. But it sounds like you didn't just settle. You waited for the right opportunity to come. And I think you were at that point in your career, however many years out of school at that point, like six years, right? 6-7 years. And so you didn't just settle, you waited for the right opportunity. And I think that's a really great illustration for a lot of people. And the comparison that you made between that hiring timeframe during the holidays to the current hiring opportunities right now. I know a lot of people whose plans have changed, recent graduates and even people who are more seasoned in their young professional careers. It's very unprecedented. That's the buzzword right now. So thank you for being so open and vulnerable with us in that capacity. Turning over to just talking about your current job right now. So tell us what you do at Nihilus. I know you're an account exec, but tell us what that day-to-day looks like. And then I'll ask you in a little bit more sales specific questions.
Sure. So we are capitalizing right now on what you may have heard of as the API economy. So we have a set of APIs that connect a platform to. So first of all, Nihilus is the thin layer of ice that lays on top of the thick under layer of ice, and that is meant to symbolize the fact that we really are meant to be in the abstraction layer that connect two pieces of software. And that's really what an API does. So for those of you that aren't familiar with APIs, when you've got two pieces of software that you want to communicate with one another, much like I think the best comparison I've heard is if you've got a TV and a cable box, you need to connect them somehow, right? And the answer is an HDMI cord. Well, if you've got two pieces of software, you need to connect those two. And the solution that everybody seems to be turning to is APIs. So for us, we live in what's called the Unified Communications as a Service space, which is a branch of the SaaS space that deals specifically with communication tools. So another big player on the other half of the space might be at Twilio, for example. And they handle everything on the phone side. We're mostly dealing with email, calendar, and contacts. And so basically, if you're trying to enhance your platform by adding email, calendar, and contact functionality, you come to us and we make it really simple to connect you to 100% of email service providers on that side. So with that background, what I do on a day-to-day basis is I am a part of a team that helps manage our inbound engine. We get a lot of interest from companies that are that know that they want us as a solution. They're reaching out to us. So that's primarily what I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis is these requests from companies that have done their own research and found Nihilus on their own and ultimately want to deal with us.
Great. And so how many employees are there at Nihilus?
We just hit 100.
Okay, great. So still medium sized. You talked a lot about
startup
tips and advice. Yeah, startup. You talked a lot about some tips and advice on how to find a sales position, particularly the one in your field. And you talked about the transition into different types of sales roles. But what would be some takeaway advice that you would want to share with people who are either in sales right now or looking at the sales profession?
Well, a lot of sales is cold outreach. And so, to my point earlier about, don't be afraid to reach out to people that have a very similar career arc as the one that you're trying to make for yourself. I think that you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and you have to be comfortable reaching out to those individuals on whatever platform it might be, right? LinkedIn, for example, was probably my best resource. And just saying, hey, your career path looks a lot like what I'm trying to do with my own career. Would love to just, if you've got 15, 30 minutes of your time, would love to take it and have a conversation with you about how you made that transition and what some of the pitfalls were and what ultimately you talked about to kind of sell yourself in a way to these companies to get them to take a chance on you. That's what you have to do. You have to sell yourself in order to get the sales role that you want. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the most invaluable lesson I learned throughout that entire process.
Yeah. Well, I'm always a big fan of utilizing LinkedIn, as you know, so full support of that. Well, I'm mindful of our time, Wilson, so I'm going to wrap it up with one very important question. Sure. Obviously, COVID-19 has impacted a lot of people. You're clearly working from home. So tell us, briefly how COVID has impacted your specific role. And then part two of the question is, I'm really interested in how people choose their backgrounds when working from home. So why did you choose this background?
It was the only place where I could really fit a desk.
Nice. Important.
And it's got if you were to look out, I'm looking outside, so it gets the most daylight.
You got some good lighting. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. I think the best lesson that I've learned, I think it's more important now than ever, is to lead with. When I was at 2U, the CEO of LinkedIn at the time, and I'm blanking on his name, came and spoke to us, and he talked about leading with empathy instead of sympathy. And I think that that in terms of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis is I know that I go into every conversation knowing that COVID's probably going to come up, knowing that it's probably going to affect timelines, knowing that it's probably going to make them extremely price sensitive. And I want to be empathetic to that. I don't want to be sympathetic to that, right? I want to make sure that I'm saying more than just I feel your pain. I want them to know that yes, I do feel their pain, but that I am going to also provide a solution that is going to work with them to make sure that that pain ultimately goes away. And the example that we were given at the time that I thought was so powerful was, if you see somebody that has fallen into a hole, do you just say, "Oh, that's too bad, you fell into a hole," or do you want to bring the ladder with you that you can put into the hole to help them get out of it? And I think that is so important in times like these, is to lead with empathy and instead of leading with sympathy. And for me, in sales, I'm the one that's supposed to be leading the conversation towards moving towards a potential partnership. And I want to do that with empathy instead of with sympathy.
I think that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Leading with empathy versus sympathy. I think that's a great way to end the interview. So thank you so much, Wilson, for taking the time and speaking to our audience today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Camber.
Wilson Roberts, everyone, and you can reach him. We'll connect his LinkedIn to this post and in our website and social platforms. So thanks again.